Welcome to Rotten Damians. Today we're discussing Slasher, The Executioner. This horror anthology series was created and written by Aaron Martin.
Slasher is about a series of murders in a small town. These are murders that are based on a killing that happened in the late 1980s.
The show draws inspiration from many sources, like Agatha Christie, hence the murder mystery aspect, the Zodiac Killer, hence the murderer's attire, and many more.
Halloween really became a touchstone for us, and we watched that a lot. And then for me too, I mean, just a lot of films from that era, specifically Brian De Palma and Dario Argento, anything where there was just a ludicrous amount of blood and just a gleeful sense of mayhem were huge influences. And then just some modern films, especially this film called It Follows.
The show also pays homage to certain slashers from the 80s, but we'll discuss more of that during the breakdown. Martin started his career as a writer on the reboot of Degrassi, which explains how he develops such strong characters and seamlessly blends horror and drama. But enough about the nitty-gritty, let's get into the breakdown. The show begins during Halloween in 1988, and right off the bat we get a camera view of pumpkins that resemble the pumpkins in the original Halloween opening sequence. The year is also 1988, which is when Michael Myers returned in Halloween 4. And lastly we get certain camera shots like this one, or that creates a cinema style similar to John Carpenter, the director in the original Halloweens. We then enter the Ingrams house. No, not the cream. Brian opens the door for the executioner and invites him inside, thinking it's his friend. But after a few minutes of one-sided dialogue, we hear a knock at the door. Surprise, surprise, it's Alan, the friend who Brian thought was the executioner. The executioner wastes no time and stabs a saw through Brian's chest. He then proceeds to saw downwards. As stated earlier, this show draws inspiration from Italian filmmaker Dario Argento, and therefore uses features of giallo, a subgenre in Italian filmmaking which basically means a shitload of gore and blood. The executioner is nice enough to let Alan off with a scar on the cheek and years of therapy. Exie the executioner begins to drag Brian to the kitchen when Rachel, his wife, walks in. She freaks out and wastes perfectly good popcorn. She then slips on her husband's blood, landing straight onto her pregnant stomach. After that we cut to the next scene where we see Exie cradling the Ingrams baby. Yes, he carved the child out of Rachel's stomach, but at least she was in her third trimester.
Last trimester's killing her.
Quite literally, Brian. Quite literally. After the intro, we meet our protagonist, Sarah, and her husband, Dylan. Sarah is the little girl that the killer was cradling, and they're moving into the house where she was born, and her parents were murdered. I hope she gets a really good deal for that house.
Free house.
Oh, good. Dylan and Sarah are deeply in love and happily married.
There are decent people who live in this neighborhood.
That rude neighbor is Verna McBride, but more on her later. The couple enter the house with a bang, and then go mingle with the locals. This is Cam, a police sergeant and Sarah's childhood best friend. Cam is a good guy who has an insane moral compass. He's always super serious and trying to do the right thing. This is Robin and Justin, Sarah's new landlords.
You thought Robin was a she and not a he?
Slasher is always incredibly inclusive by writing in gay, trans, and bisexual characters, which is always amazing to see, but especially in 2016 when this season was released, because it was less common for the LGBT plus community to be featured in film. Robin and Justin are Sarah's landlords to a new store. She is an artist. Sarah asks Dylan if he can use his editor privilege to find footage from the case of her parents' murder. This show has a strong religious undertone, hence the opening scene features a sermon playing on the radio.
Hell is real!
The reason for this is to tie in with the murderer, who kills his victims according to the 7 deadly sins. Sarah, upset that Tom, the local family murderer, called her mother a slut, decides to go blow off some steam with a night walk. During her walk, she spots a copycat executioner. At first, she decides to ignore him while he just stands there watching her, but Exie forces her to acknowledge him by sprinting towards her. It's also so nice of Exie to motivate Sarah to get healthy by making her run. Good for you. This scene reminded me of It Follows, with the long pause before the action eventually picks up.
Don't open the door. See? Everything's okay.
She manages to outrun the killer just as Dylan appears in the street. He confronts a couple of kids thinking that they are the ones who scared his wife. After Dylan's confrontation, all the kids split except for one, who decides to take out his home issues on Dylan's mailbox. He sees the executioner and tries to impress him with some awesome drifting, but Exie isn't impressed and takes his bat. Bro, I don't know who raised this kid, but they obviously never taught him about stranger danger, especially to strangers dressed as a psychopath. Anyway, Exie begins beating on the kid using his own bat, and we have a child murder. I've said it before, I love child murder in horror because it's so unexpected and taboo. I also never understood how murdering this kid fits into the agenda of the 7 deadly sins, but maybe it's just a cheap scare for the viewers. The next morning, Sarah goes to visit the friendly neighborhood murderer, but she doesn't like what she sees because he's smiling at her when she's literally there to confront him about murdering her family. So she decides to leave. The scenes between Tom and Sarah always give me flashbacks to the relationship between Hannibal Lecter and Clarice in Silence of the Lambs.
Maybe you can decide for yourself whether or not I'm qualified enough to do that.
That is rather slippery of you, Agent Starling.
Sarah comes home and decides to comfort herself by watching her parents' sex tape. Just kidding. It's her mom and some random guy named Peter McBride, and apparently there are many other tapes. Sarah immediately leaves the house and goes to confront Cam. She asks him if he knew that her parents were hoes. The reason she is asking him is because his father is Alan, her father Brian's best friend, or the guy that escaped with a scar on his cheek. While Sarah is speaking to Cam, Dylan arrives home, but Verna tells him that Sarah just left, looking very upset. Dylan decides to go look for Sarah, and apparently these people don't even lock their door because Verna McBride lets herself in. Can you imagine not locking your door after you literally moved into the house where your in-laws were murdered? Anyway, Verna makes herself at home by grabbing a slice of pizza and indulging in the Ingrams porn stash. It is the perfect evening, apart from the fact that the porn on the TV is her ex-husband sleeping with Sarah's mom when they were still married. Verna steals the tape and goes back home. Verna at home brushes her teeth and we see some tears rolling down her cheeks. I felt really bad for her, and it explains why she hated Sarah. She obviously knew that her husband was unfaithful to her, or she had assumptions that were now confirmed. We hear creaking on the floorboard, which Verna chooses to ignore, but on her way to the bedroom, we see Exie in the background, standing there in true Michael Myers fashion. When she sees him, Exie sprints and tackles her. He then drags her onto the bed and proceeds to zip tie her feet and hands to the bedpost. He then proceeds to cut off her hands and feet. Then we switch to Sarah, who pauses Psycho on the TV because she hears Verna's cries. She lets herself in at Verna's and makes her way upstairs, where she sees Verna tied to the bed with her hands and feet removed and scattered everywhere. She then sees Exie and trips and knocks her head. The killer does nothing except look at her and return the tape back to her. Perhaps he doesn't want to hurt her so that she can tell the public that the executioner is back, which is exactly what she does. We then cut to the funeral where Alan the priest gives a monologue speaking about death and sin, which is overlaid with clips of the townfolk committing sins like indulging in drugs or prostitution. As I said earlier, the show has a strong religious undertone because the killer murders his victims according to the 7 deadly sins. Verna's sin is anger, and the punishment is live dismemberment, which is exactly what Exie did. Before the episode ends, Sarah goes to see Tom again, and they decide that they'll be working together to catch the murderer, just like Hannibal and Clarice. And that's the first episode. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this breakdown, please like, comment and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow and for me to reach my goals.